Hey, it's Kurt. Hey, I just wanted to walk you through a scenario that comes up in our practice all the time, and that is, should I sell my house right now or should I rent it out? And there's some important tax implications to that. And you really need to understand the window of opportunity that you have to test that out. Or you should be looking at, am I in this for the long haul? There's a lot of important considerations here, and we'll walk you through some of those. Okay, so let's walk through a real life scenario because it's important to plug in real numbers to this in order to understand how this all works. So what I've got here is a house that was purchased years ago. It was purchased for $245,000. There was some money put into the house, just some minor improvements, let's say like refinishing the kitchen or something like that. $25K. And so the adjusted basis, you take that $245,000 purchase price, and now I'm able to add some of the improvements that I made to the house. That adjusted basis compares to the value of what I would sell for, and it gives me some sense, not the true sense, but some sense as to what my taxable gain would be. So one thing to keep in mind, if I were looking at this and saying $635,000 against a $270,000 basis, so in that scenario, I'm looking at a $365,000 gross gain. Now, in reality, my gain may be a little bit different because I may be saying that I'm going to use a realtor to sell the house. And so I would take some of the closing costs associated with that I'm going to pay. Maybe I have to make some concessions. But the important thing in this scenario is to recognize that I've lived in the house for years. So this is someone who's lived in the house for 20 years, let's say. So in this scenario, the IRS allows for a married filing joint couple a $500,000 capital gain exclusion, which is awesome because my number is 365, therefore I pay no tax. So if I sell right now, I can pocket the proceeds and move on. Now, notice I did not look at the mortgage balance in the equation here. What matters is selling price minus selling costs, minus the capital improvements, minus that adjusted basis. And so if I factor all that in and get to that number, and if it's over $500,000, then I would pay some tax on that number. So people that have lived in their home for a long time, or if they're in a place where that home is really skyrocketed in value, you may end up actually be sitting on a capital gain right now, and you need to be aware of that too. Now, there's a window of opportunity here because that 2 out of 5 years means that you would have been able to rent the house for up to 3 years. That in other words, like if I were looking back 5 years ago, and did I have a continuous period for 2 years where I lived there? Well, that means that I would have rented for 3 and lived there for 2. Now, that 3 years is tight. And that means this. It means if you rent it on 3 12-month engagements, 12-month leases, you are really at the wire because you're going to have to sell while that person is still in your home. So that puts you in jeopardy of actually getting this 2 out of 5 year capital gain exclusion. You better be able to meet that to the day in that scenario. And so you really, realistically, you may be leasing out for like 2.5 years. So that's the scenario I ran. Now, you may be living in a market that's appreciating in value. Maybe it's increasing greater than 2%, but the real estate market's kind of weird right now. And so we've noticed in Colorado that sometimes it has gone up like 5 to 6% and sometimes even higher in some neighborhoods. And then now all of a sudden it's kind of slowing down. And so maybe I'm not going that fast. So at a 2% appreciation rate, meaning it's just kind of inching up a little bit, then I've got something important to consider here, and that is that maybe leasing out for 2.5 years gets me the ability to try out leasing, but I've got an important consideration on that 2 out of 5 year capital gain exclusion. So what would happen is this. Let's say I lease it out for 2.5 years. In the future, I'm assuming that it's not going to be 635. Maybe it's going to go up to 667, right? And so that's based on a 2% annual rate of return. Then I've got some selling costs for selling the house. Check with the realtor in your area, but these vary 3% to 6 or 7% depending on the market. And then I may pay a capital gains tax on the sale, plus state tax, plus a net investment income tax in that sale. So in that scenario also, you have to depreciate the home. It's not if you want to. You have to. The IRS forces that depreciation recapture, whether you took it or not. So you have to pay income tax at 25% at the federal level in order to recapture that depreciation. So there's costs associated with renting it out. But can you imagine this? I still now have a $378,000 gain on the house because I lived there for 2.5 years, and I for more than 2.5 years, but I rented it for 2.5. So I've got a 4.5 year window, 2 years of rental ownership, or 2 years of personal use and 2.5 years of rental ownership. That gives me the 5 year capital gain exclusion, the 2 out of 5 capital gain exclusion. I get a $500,000 exclusion. I don't have to pay tax on that 378. So my tax, zero. Now I do have to recapture some depreciation because I tested the waters, right? I was renting this house out and I have to recapture some of that. So I'm gonna pay $5,000 in tax. Now I collected some money over the course of time and that was good. But now I have to recapture some of that income tax. The net proceeds, maybe my mortgage now is a $350,000 balance. And before you get after me on this, keep in mind, this is a scenario where somebody lived in the house for a long time. The reason they got to this low interest rate was because in the 2020s, maybe the interest rate allowed them to do a cash out refi. That's why the mortgage in this equation doesn't really matter to the consideration, but it does for the after tax, like how much you walk away with. So one thing to keep in mind, you would have, you'd be able to keep the vast majority of the money that you're making in this scenario. You would be able to make a good deal of money on the sale proceeds. You'd walk away with $271,000 and you don't have to pay tax. And the reason this is important is because the delta between this and this is that cash out refi that occurred in 2020 and 2021, right? I'm pulling out less money than what I actually am excluding because I already pulled out $100,000 a few years ago. That's where like those cash out refis, they could be a problem. So in this scenario, you need to be aware of what it looks like if you rent it 4 years. Now you're past that window. You're gonna deal with the capital gains tax. So you've got this gain of 410. You don't have an exclusion to offset it. You've got a capital gain tax and you've got some depreciation recapture. So it's kind of comprised of two different numbers. You're gonna pay a good amount of tax. Your walk away money is $219. It's less. That's a $52,000 difference. Now, to be fair, you made money on this house. You rented it out, you paid some expenses, you had a taxable profit. Your net after tax, in 49K in 2.5 years. In 4 years, you're making close to $80,000. So if I compare that to this 52, maybe I'm okay. But I also may have spent a considerable amount of money on refurbishing the place, or maybe the HVAC went out or something like that. Those are big expenses that you have to have reserves for and be able to pay for. And so it kind of becomes a wash. If you're not getting a ton of appreciation on the home, and that's kind of the risk right now in this market, is contraction. It is maybe a reversal of growth. Maybe instead of just stagnating, maybe it actually declines in value. Those are real considerations right now. And that really puts the onus on this predictable, like rent it for 2 years to 2.5 years to get this capital gain exclusion. This is a much more likely scenario. And it's something that you should really consider if you're renting your home out, especially if you've owned it for a while, or if you do have a lot of gain that you're sitting on in the background. So I don't know, food for thought. The tax equation here is something that is important to throw your own numbers into. It's important to consider it based on your own scenario so you're not blindsided. And what you don't want to do is end up paying a significantly higher income tax in the future because you didn't understand the implications of the decision. To me, on a home, I would much rather, if I've lived there for 2 out of the last 5 years, I would much rather either sell or rent it out for 2 to 2.5 years, because I don't necessarily want to put myself in the position of making this home illiquid. Now I could sell, I could pay the capital gain, but boy, if I have to sell at 3 years or 3 years and a month because I'm need the cash, now I've got a huge tax bill in order to need the cash and a big difference in the income requirement here. Then my options are limited. Now I would have to do a 1031 exchange into another property. That's fine, but those are scenarios that if you need cash quick and you need to be able to liquidate, this home is no longer that. So I'm of the vantage point that if you've lived there, man, you deal with that $500,000 capital gain exclusion, and you just keep doing that every 2 to 3 years if that's your gig, or you rent it out for 2.5 so that you can make sure that you get this $500,000 capital gain exclusion. To me, that's the best way to build wealth in this situation, so that you've got a predictable net after tax, and then you can always buy other rental properties, pay them down quickly, in even at a higher interest rate in this, because you would have better flexibility in that type of environment, especially if you've lived in it for a long time. So that's something that you should be thinking about whenever you are confronted with the question, should I rent or should I sell? Thanks.